are the Appalachian Mountains, North America's first mountain range. It is estimated to be nearly 500 million years old, and it extends over 2,000 miles and stretches across 13 states, from the foothills in northern Georgia and Alabama and reaching up into the northern highlands of Maine and Canada. Known for its incredible beauty and rich biodiversity, this vast wilderness is home to a variety of animals, such as moose, black bears, bobcats, white-tailed deer, hawks, as well as the greatest diversity of salamanders on the planet. Among these species, the Orianne Society has determined one apex predator to be of vital importance to the southern Appalachian region, but is facing tremendous challenges towards its conservation. It is an animal that we have felt threatened by and have demonized for centuries, compromising our own capacity for understanding them. This animal is the timber rattlesnake.
I like to call the timber rattlesnake America's snake, and that's for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a long human history. This is the rattlesnake that people first encountered when they came to North America. European people coming, across the Atlantic. We removed a lot of the animals like bison and elk, mountain lions, animals that would have historically been here. But you can still go out on a really remote mountain ridge and just find a giant timber rattlesnake sitting out on a rock cliff, just kind of looking out over this landscape. And to me, when I see that, it's inspiring. I look at this just icon, this image of the mountains, and it tells me that I'm still in a wild place, that we still have wild places in eastern North America.
The timber rattlesnake is a large and robust snake, reaching up to 4 feet long. Their coloration varies from yellow to brown to gray, but the basic pattern found on these magnificent animals are dark, W-shaped bands repeating across the body on a lighter background. The tail is darker, often black, ending with the rattle, which is held upright when the snake feels threatened. The timber rattlesnake can be found in temperate forests throughout the eastern United States, where suitable denning habitat is available. Places where they can venture deep underground to protect themselves from freezing temperatures in the cold days of winter.
Rattlesnakes don't overwinter to stay warm. They overwinter so they don't freeze. There's a big difference there because their temperatures can go down to the high 30s Fahrenheit. So we know that timber rattlesnakes enter hibernation when the temperatures get too cold on the surface. How do they know when to leave hibernation if they're deep underground? It's the same cues that trigger trees to begin to leaf and to bud. That is deep soil temperatures. You can begin by thinking they spend 6 months out of the year underground. Once they are in the spring, come out of that den. If you are a mated female, you need to seek out warmer habitats, increase your metabolism to gestate your young. If you are a snake that needs to shed its skin, you must seek out warmer places for the same reason. Or if you've eaten a meal. Their entire life history is tied around this need to manage their body temperature. And I might add, they're incredibly expert at it.
In addition to managing their body temperature using the habitat around them, the timber rattlesnakes face many of the same challenges as other animals during the warmer months: finding shelter, seeking a mate, and foraging for food.
Many rattlesnakes will be migrating to a foraging ground, and they'll make these long-distance, relatively rapid movements until they find areas of relatively high prey density or small mammals, and then they'll set up and they'll spend the summer doing much different types of movements, staying in a much smaller area. Then they'll pick up the scent of mammals, or the chemical cues of these mammals, and they run it by an organ in the mouth called the Jacobson's organ. It'd be like if I could go through this forest right now and smell and tell you that on that log, a squirrel walked by there in the last 2 hours. And so it's a very acute sense. So they pick areas to sit and wait for sometimes days, and they'll wait for that mammal to come through that high traffic area and then strike it.
Snakes are one of the most maligned animals on the planet, perhaps because a small percentage of them have developed a unique way of hunting and immobilizing their prey. And how did they do that? That's right, with venom.
So this may surprise some people, but venom in most snakes, including timber rattlesnakes, is not developed to hurt people. In fact, in timber rattlesnakes, it's not a defensive venom. There are some animals on the planet that have a defensive venom, but timber rattlesnakes have venom for feeding. They need it. First of all, you have to think of a rattlesnake sitting in the woods foraging. A mouse comes by and it strikes that mouse. So it allows it to kill its prey with very minimal contact. Then you can imagine if you're laying in this forest environment, but you're really a couple inches off the ground, and you just injected venom into your meal and your meal ran off, it could be hard to find. And so they need to track it down, and they use the tongue. You see, when they tongue flick, they're picking up chemicals in the environment, and they're bringing them back across the Jacobson organ in their mouth and identifying what they are. They're cueing in on the chemical signature of their own venom. So it kills their prey, and then they use it to track the prey down so they get to eat it. And then thirdly, it digests the animal. So you could think of it almost functioning like digestive enzymes.
As the seasons change, their needs change. Mating occurs from mid-July to mid-September. The female timber rattlesnake gives birth in late August or early September. Here, she has had 11 offspring. But what is critically important is that this snake probably mated the previous summer.
In the middle of July, the males begin to make very long movements. What we know that they're doing is they're attempting to intercept the scent trails of receptive females. So as these females move through a woodland, they're leaving a scent trail, and the males travel far and wide to encounter that. And once they do, they will follow her until they find her. At times, there are other males that have also encountered that scent trail, and they may show up there at the same time. And if they do, these males go through what can only be described as a ritualistic combat, in the sense that one just achieves dominance over the other male by pushing it to the ground, if you will. And eventually, the loser slinks away now that the victor has access to the female. She stores that sperm, goes into hibernation, spends 6 months underground in the spring, moves to a special thermal habitat where she can keep her body temperature warm 24 hours a day, and then she gives birth in late August or early September.
One of the most surprising traits of timber rattlesnakes is the parental care shown by the mother after birth. She will typically stay with her young for 1 or 2 weeks, watching over and protecting them until they first shed their skins and venture out on their own. These young timber rattlesnakes have a long and dangerous road ahead. Female rattlesnakes who are lucky enough to survive their youth may take up to around 10 years to reach sexual maturity. Timber rattlesnakes can live to over 50 years old, but many live a much shorter life. Since it takes years to gather the energy and resources to be able to birth one litter, they might only have a few reproductive cycles in their lifetime to try to replace themselves in the breeding population. It's no wonder that timber rattlesnakes and many other reptiles can face devastating losses to their populations with the removal of just a few members. In addition to the challenges these snakes face in the wild, these places have faced an ever-increasing amount of environmental change. These drastic alterations to their habitat are due to human development that began thousands of years ago and continues to this very day.
Most people automatically assume that this area was settled first by the Scots-Irish. And while that's true, the Scots-Irish certainly were not the first people here. For thousands of years, the Cherokee, as well as other indigenous peoples, have been able to trace their ancestry here, inhabiting this place. That type of long-term habitation of this place has developed into a really unique and special relationship between the indigenous peoples and this landscape, as well as the flora and fauna here. But as we see industrialization start to make its way into the Appalachians, especially through revolutions in transportation, people need to start making money. They need to start having cash. And so many of them turn to an easy method of engaging in this economy, and that was harvesting trees from their properties. And unfortunately, this ultimately, by the 1940s, 1950s, led to the complete deforestation of old-growth trees.
The southern Appalachian forests are mostly protected, but that landscape has greatly changed. The decline of the American chestnut also heavily impacted the forest ecology in the Appalachian region. Chestnuts were a consistent and abundant food source for many species that have now disappeared.
The American chestnut was an iconic tree. I think 50% of Appalachian forests were comprised of chestnut. It's hard for us to fathom the amount of food that produced for wildlife, but all of the oak species combined today do not produce the amount of food that the chestnuts produce. It's also the most economically valuable tree the Appalachians has ever had. You know, in the early 1900s, the chestnut blight, the fungus was introduced, and we slowly lost the chestnut. But what we see here today is not indicative of what we had before European settlement.
The loss of the American chestnut altered the entire food chain of the region. Many forest species, mammals depending on this food source, and predators like timber rattlesnakes depending on those mammals, experienced drastic declines. Not only do the trees suffer from diseases, but so do the wildlife. Ophidiomycosis, also known as snake fungal disease, has been silently spreading and affecting snakes across North America. The transmission of the disease is still a mystery.
What the snake fungal disease does is it basically attacks the skin of the snake. You'll notice a lot of kind of like facial lesions around the snake, which can lead to issues for the snake eating, breathing, all of these things that are real critical for its survival. Here, specifically in the southern Appalachians, while we haven't done extensive studies in the mountains, we have found it in multiple places in multiple states in mountain populations of timber rattlesnakes.
Protecting the timber rattlesnake means ensuring the health of its populations and their diverse habitats. Conservation on this scale is a great challenge, and the Orianne Society works with a variety of partners towards this goal by monitoring their populations, providing education programs, as well as landscape planning and translocation services for landowners. One very effective tool for maintaining and protecting these landscapes involves an element that evokes fear and apprehension and is not yet well understood by the general public. That is fire.
Fire is critical for maintaining biodiversity. It's the most important tool as a land manager that we have to maintain the biodiversity that this region is known for. At today's level, we're burning about 15 to 20% of what we should be burning to reach our goals for conserving biodiversity and conserving the fire-dependent plants and animals. The Nature Conservancy, the Orianne Society, and a whole host of partners are working together to get more fire on the ground. And so there's specific forests, specific types of forest within this southern Appalachian ecosystem, and each has a unique set of plant and animal species. Rattlesnakes are just one of those. But they have spent thousands of years of evolution adapting to the environment that was here as of 100 years ago. They don't have the ability mostly to adapt, to evolve as quickly as we've changed the environment.
By returning fire to the landscape and helping to maintain the natural processes that have created habitat for plant and animal species in the southern Appalachians, we can help to maintain the biodiversity that this region is known for. In addition to habitat restoration, states like Georgia and North Carolina have begun to put regulations in place and are making great strides towards timber rattlesnake conservation.
Timber rattlesnakes in North Carolina are protected as a species of special concern, but because of some of the life history traits that they have, such as delayed maturity, low number of animals at reproduction, some don't even reproduce even 3, 4, 5 years in a row. All of these sorts of factors tell us that when we lose a single individual on the landscape, it can have significant repercussions, especially those older adults. And so timber rattlesnakes in the Appalachians face so many threats. The number one that most people would tell you is some sort of habitat alteration, be it outright loss through development, fragmentation because of development pressures and creating roads and road mortality. All of those sorts of pieces are really critically difficult for animals, wildlife to navigate. If you have feathers and you can fly away, you might find another patch of forest that'll work for you. If you're about 1 inch high on the ground and you need to slither to your new location, that's much more difficult, much more challenging.
States across the range have completed a range-wide timber rattlesnake conservation action plan. This plan provides a roadmap of how to conserve timber rattlesnakes in the southern Appalachians.
The Timber Rattlesnake Conservation Action Plan is a comprehensive volume that covers the genetics, the biology, field methods specifically to timber rattlesnakes, the needs, the conservation needs of the species, as well as there's an account from each state in which they occur across their range from rattlesnake experts in those states. It's a reference and it's a guide for anyone that wants to learn about the snake, or if they find themselves as a land manager, a state agency, or an individual with property that has timber rattlesnakes, this information is not available anywhere in one place, but it is now, and that's what we sought to do.
Despite these efforts, one monumental challenge still exists towards timber rattlesnake conservation: fear. Why is the general population afraid of snakes? There are likely some innate reactions that humans are born with, cautionary behaviors to keep ourselves safe, but much of this fear is taught and learned.
One of the tales that you'll hear often through this region is about a different variation of what's known as a stinger snake or a hoop snake, or you might even hear it called a joint snake. And it's this great story of this monstrous snake that was several feet long, covered in scales, but also in feathers. And it had a 3-inch long stinger on the back of it instead of like a rattle. And what it would do is it would roll up into a hoop shape with the stinger in its mouth, and it would roll down the hill after you. When it would finish rolling, it would unfurl, and that stinger would fly through the air and try to strike you. So it just really became this fantastical aspect that was often retold through oral traditions here in Appalachia.
Fantastical stories of snakes, like this one, exist throughout history. With such fear instilled in us by stories in our past, and how snakes are now portrayed in pop culture, is it any wonder that we still fear snakes today? How do we deal with this unjust persecution?
In my mind, the best way to deal with human persecution of timber rattlesnakes, there's really multiple prongs, but it all focuses around education and knowledge. By teaching people snakes are animals too. They're not just this random animal that was placed on the landscape to hurt people. That's so far from the truth. They're just like any other animal. I'm not trying to deny timber rattlesnakes, can be life-threatening to people. But people also need to realize there are a lot of things out there that you have a much higher chance of dying from, whether that be horses, bumblebees, driving your car to work in the morning. Your chances of dying from a timber rattlesnake bite are really low.
There are places in North Carolina where you can go into a country store and see pictures on the wall of dead rattlesnakes and people holding them up. But there's no consequence for that. Now, if those folks were holding up pictures of bald eagles, they would be found and prosecuted. But it's not done with timber rattlesnakes. Even those that work on behalf of wildlife often have a subconscious bias about rattlesnakes.
Wherever rattlesnakes and people come into connection with one another, there will be some sort of issues that can arise. So one thing we can do to try to mitigate that is help educate people about the life history of these animals, the temperament of these animals. They're very calm animals, especially if you understand a lot about their biology. So there are certainly ways that humans and snakes can live together.
For now, there are still wild places in the southern Appalachians, and timber rattlesnakes can still bask on their rock cliffs, looking out over the landscape. We may not all grow to love snakes, but we can overcome these fears and help to protect these wild animals and wild places to make sure they stay that way for future generations. To support the effort to conserve timber rattlesnakes and the habitats they depend on, visit www.orianne.org.